Hey guys, it's Christian. So I want to do something new on my channel. This is going to be a complete review of the Scott Pilgrim graphic novel series. I'm a huge fan of this series and obviously a huge fan of the movie as well. And with the anime coming, I thought it'd be really cool to just kind of go through the graphic novel series and give my thoughts on each of them. Just because based on the trailers, it just looks like they're going to stay more true to the graphic novels as opposed to the movie. I love the movie, but obviously they had to cut a lot of stuff out and, adapt things and change things around. So I thought it'd be fun to go through the series and then see how it compares to the anime when it finally comes out. And for this review, it's not going to be a breakdown of every single event that happens within the graphic novels. It's just kind of my overall thoughts on the series, and then I'll probably talk about specific points here and there. So without further ado, let's jump in. So first up, we have Volume 1, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life. Overall, I think this is a really good introduction to the world of Scott Pilgrim, and then introducing the character of Scott himself. And obviously, he's not the best guy. It starts off with him in a situation where he's dating a 17-year-old named Knives Chow, and he's a 23-year-old himself. And then it kind of gets revealed later on that he's actually trying to get over a big breakup he had with a character named Envy Adams, who gets revealed at the end of Volume 2. And the whole backstory with that is that back in college, Envy, who used to be called Natalie, used to be this really nerdy girl, but Scott Steven Still's the talent, and Natalie were all in a band together. As time went on, tension kind of rose, and Natalie decided to kind of go off and do her own thing. And that kind of left Scott Steven kind of left in the dust, and they decided to form their own group, Sex Bomb. And then it's also revealed that Scott has a really bad memory. So from his point of view, he thinks that Envy cut off the relationship, but then it gets revealed later on that Scott may have been the one who ended the relationship. Another element to his character is that he doesn't drink, but it's kind of implied that he may have had a drinking problem before, and that's what kind of dulled his memories about all these different breakups that he had in the past. And speaking of other breakups, another character that he broke up with beforehand was the character of Kim Pine. And actually I really like Kim Pine. I know in the movies they didn't really give her too much to do, but in the comics she actually gets a lot of backstory. Like at the beginning of Volume 2, it gets revealed that she dated Scott back in high school, that they had a really good relationship, but Scott being Scott didn't tell Kim that he's actually moving away from Toronto, and then Kim obviously gets very upset and then kind of gets left behind. And there's actually this really cool action scene at the beginning of Volume 2 where Scott's going against this guy named Simon Lee and then all of his minions, but then it gets revealed later on in Volume 6 that he may have just been fantasizing about all that, and that Simon Lee, instead of being this big bad character, is actually like this really small nerdy kid, and that Scott kind of stole Kim away from him. But anyway, back into Volume 1. So as time goes on, Scott has his relationship with Knives, but then we get introduced to the character Ramona Flowers. It's kind of like the girl of Scott's dreams. Like literally she's kind of running through his dreams because it gets revealed that there's this thing called subspace within people's heads, especially the character of Scott, that she uses to make deliveries back and forth from Amazon. So in order to talk to her, he orders CDs from Amazon in the hopes that she would deliver them to him. So they meet, they have their little date, they sleep with each other, but they don't sleep with each other. He invites her to this performance of the Rocket, but then unfortunately he told Knives way earlier to come to the performance as well. So now the characters meet at the Rocket, they're kind of eyeing each other because Knives is really forward and kisses Scott, and Ramona's like, wait, what's going on? But before anything can be confirmed with that, a character named Matthew Patel crashes through the ceiling and challenges Scott to a fight. And that's another subplot that gets weaved throughout the novel, is the fact that Ramona has a group of 7 evil exes, and they actually formed a league in order to control the future of Ramona's love life. And I actually like the character of Matthew Patel. I know he kind of has like a brief appearance in the first novel, and then he gets defeated after he fights with Scott, but it would have been really cool if we kind of got more of him. But hopefully we'll get him more in the anime, so we'll see what happens with that. So then Scott defeats Matthew, and then realizes that Ramona actually has 6 other evil exes out there that he has to defeat in order to continue dating Ramona. So the first novel ends there, and then we go on to Volume 2, and overall I think this one's okay. This one's not my favorite of the series. It's kind of more just like a self-contained story. Like obviously they have the stuff in the beginning with the whole flashbacks of Kim and Scott dating, and then we also get introduced to the character of Lisa Miller, who kind of befriended Scott in high school and then kind of introduced her to the character of Kim Pine, and they start their amateur band together, and then she gets brought up again in Volume 4. But the main issue that Scott's facing is that he's continued to date Ramona, but he hasn't broken up with Knives yet. And the character of Wallace Wells is actually one of my favorite characters, is kind of encouraging him to break up with Knives in order to continue dating Ramona. But Scott being Scott, he's very, very reluctant, but then eventually he finally breaks up with Knives after she tells him that she loves him, and then continues to date Ramona. So then everything's good at the moment. Scott and Ramona are dating, Scott's cooking her meals and everything like that. And then on the flip side, Wallace is preparing Scott for his next battle with a character named Lucas Lee. And yeah, Lucas Lee is actually, I think he's a pretty fun character. I actually kind of like him better in the movie, the way that Chris Evans portrayed him. He kind of gives Lucas a little bit more personality. And then in the graphic novel, Lucas Lee is a pro skater who turned actor and is kind of like a sellout. So he's doing all these different cheesy action movies. And then Wallace's homework for Scott is to watch all these Lucas Lee movies and then kind of get more background on him so that when they actually do fight, he'll be able to defeat him. So then we actually get to the fight, and there's not really too much to it. Lucas kind of beats up on Scott a little bit, but they decide to take a break and just talk things out. Lucas tells Scott more about Ramona's backstory and the fact that he was kind of like a snot-nosed kid, and he kind of just went out for him for like a week or so, and then went out with another character named Todd Ingram, who will get introduced later on. So it's kind of like revealing that Ramona's like not the best character. Previously she dated Matthew Patel just despite all the jock boys, and then just dated Lucas Lee because, he was a snot-nosed brat who just kept following her around everywhere, and then started dating Todd the moment he walked by. Obviously, Scott's not going to let that get to him, and then decides to keep dating Ramona. And then Lucas decides to challenge him to another fight. But then, Scott being the clever guy that he is, kind of feeds into Lucas's ego and challenges him, hey, but you can't do a grind on this rail. And obviously, they kind of cut to this photo of this kind of dangerous looking rail that goes down this giant hill. And then Lucas being Lucas is obviously not going to back down from a fight. So then he goes down and actually blows up into a bunch of coins. And Scott actually gets a mithril skateboard, but since he's not that level yet, he's not able to obtain it. And that's another aspect I actually kind of like about these graphic novels, is that the whole kind of video game aspect of it all, where it really feels like a kind of like classic arcade game, or like a Tekken game or Mortal Kombat game or something. Yeah, there's a lot of like self-awareness and like references to video games and pop culture and everything. So yeah, that's something I really appreciate about what Brian Lee O'Malley does with the comics. So then later we get introduced to the character of Envy Adams, who actually reaches out to Scott and actually invites him and the rest of Texas Bomb to a performance of theirs. And of course, Scott technically still has feelings for Envy, so even though he's kind of resistant to the idea, he kind of slowly but surely kind of goes with it. We cut to Scott and his friends at the performance by Envy and her new band, the Clash of Demon Head, and we get to reveal that Todd Ingram is actually in that band and is actually the third Evil X that Scott has to face. And then it kind of leads us right into Volume 3. I actually really like Volume 3. That's like one of my favorites. I think it's probably like my second favorite out of the whole series. We kind of pick up right where we left off with Volume 2, and we cut to backstage where there's some tension between Scott and his friends, and then between Clash of Demon Head. And then we get introduced to the character of Lynette, who's the third member of Clash of Demon Head, and she has this bionic arm, and she actually punches out Knives Chow for speaking out of turn, and she punches the highlights out of her hair. And then we get that fun line that was actually in the movie as well. It's like, she punched the highlights out of her hair. And then, that upsets Scott. He tries to go into the kill with Todd. Then it gets revealed that Todd actually has psychic powers because he's a vegan. So they have a brief fight, but then it ends. And then Envy says that, hey, we should pick this up again sometime later on. And that's kind of like one of the subplots that happens throughout the story, is not only the whole conflict between Scott and Todd, but also between Scott and Envy, and then between Envy and Ramona, and between Ramona and Todd. So it's kind of this whole love square situation going on, with Knives kind of in the background a little bit. So they have a second battle at Honest Ed's, which is kind of like this old thrift store, and they have to kind of run from one side to the other, but it kind of has this curse where it kind of messes with the people's minds, and Todd has this kind of like flashback to his father where he first became a vegan, and he ends up kind of psychically destroying Honest Ed. So it's like, well, there goes the end of that. So then they decide to just pick it up later. And then as the story goes on, it kind of gets revealed that Todd is actually cheating on Envy with Lynette. And then during one of the performances at the end of the novel, Todd comes walking in with Lynette. He has her underwear on his head. Obviously, Envy gets upset, kicks down the crotch. And they actually put that in the movie, but they had it be Ramona do that to Gideon. Scott finally steps up and tries to battle Todd, but Todd is still too powerful. And then Scott's like, I wonder if there's like some kind of Deus Ex Machina thing that can happen that can help me out here. And that's when we get the vegan police, because Todd broke his oath because it gets revealed that he actually ate gelato and chicken parmesan and all these vegan-y violations. So then the vegan police use their de-veganizing rays, and then Todd loses his powers. Then Scott headbutts Todd, and then he bursts into coins. So that's the end of that battle. Then we also get introduced to the character of Gideon Graves in a brief little cameo. So then it seems like everything's all good. We finally get into Volume 4. I think Volume 4 is my favorite one out of like all the graphic novels, because Scott actually goes through the most growth in this story. He gets a new job, he moves out of his old apartment with Wallace, he finally moves into a new apartment with Ramona. And I really like how it kind of starts off this whole kind of like slice of life situation that the characters are in, and the fact that the first couple pages are in color, which is really, really cool. They're kind of just doing their thing. They're finally kind of all friends. Obviously that comes to an end with these two different enemies that pop up, one being Knives Chow's father, who has this kind of like samurai sword and kind of like goes after Scott at these random moments, and this other situation where the fourth Evil X, Roxy Richter, comes back into Ramona's life and creates all this tension. And then we have another situation with Lisa Miller coming back into Scott's life and then kind of creating this jealousy with Ramona. So as the story goes on, there starts to be more tension between the characters. Scott's kind of hanging out with Lisa a little bit more, and then Ramona is kind of starting to drift away a little bit and hang out with Roxy a little bit more. Then it kind of all culminates into this one last battle where Scott actually pits Knives' father against Roxy, because Roxy is a half ninja, and they kind of mistake each other for enemies. But then Ramona kind of encourages Scott to, fight his own battles. So then he finally steps in and then faces Knives' father and says that he never touched her, he never did anything to betray her or anything, but obviously he's just trying to make himself look good. And then he kind of turns to Roxy and finally battles her. It's because as the story was going on, Roxy was sleeping over with Ramona, and they were kind of going out to lunch with each other and catching up, and Scott's jealousy was kind of festering even more. Then we also get introduced to the character of Nega Scott, which is the negative version of Scott, which is kind of his repressed emotions and anxieties and anger, which we'll get to later on in Volume 6. So then Roxy and Scott have their battle. Scott obviously defeats Roxy and then professes his love for Ramona, and then Ramona feels the same way, and they kind of have their moment together at the very end of the novel. And that kind of leads us into Volume 5, which kind of takes place a couple months later. And again, this one was okay. It's kind of like another self-contained story. I mean, it obviously ends with a really big cliffhanger, but it's kind of like one of those novels okay, we kind of have to get through this to get to the climax. And overall, I think it's really good. We get introduced to the character characters of the Katinagi twins, Ken and Kyle, and the characters are going to a Day of the Dead party thrown by Julie. Instead of Scott fighting the twins right away, the twins actually set out a bunch of robots after Scott. That kind of becomes a subplot as the story goes on. Scott and the robots are kind of just fighting in the background, but the real drama is really the relationship stuff, especially the fact that Scott finds out that Ramona cheated on the twins at the same time. She wasn't dating them at the same time, but she was just cheating on one with the other, so that obviously broke their heart and caused them to join the League. We also have Knives, who's still hurt by Scott, and then there's this whole kind of fun subplot throughout the graphic novels that she's actually dating young Neil just to make Scott jealous, but obviously it doesn't really work, so she breaks up with him and kind of breaks young Neil's heart. And then young Neil is this kind of like angsty teenager. He's just like kind of hanging out in his room and kind of talking back to everyone, and doesn't really know where he wants to be in life. Also, for the other characters, we have Steven Stills, who doesn't really want to continue on with band practice anymore. He wants to record his album with a character named Joseph, who's Kim's roommate, because back in the earlier volumes, Kim actually moves out of her old apartment because she just can't handle her roommates anymore and decides to be roommates with her coworker Holly and kind of just start over from there. And then of course it gets revealed in this volume that Steven actually tells Knives that Scott was cheating on her with Ramona. So then Knives is even more upset, and then reveals to Ramona later on that Scott cheated on both of them, and that's actually an element that gets revealed at the end of the movie, but with this one it happens in volume 5. So now obviously Ramona's feeling very upset, brings this up with Scott. Scott admits it, after being drunk after the party, and then Ramona's head starts to glow and she becomes super upset. And that's another element that gets revealed in this story is the whole glow situation, which doesn't happen in the movie, but happens here in the graphic novels. But yeah, it's something that will get revealed too later on in the story, so I'll probably get to that later. But it is an interesting element in the story where every time Ramona gets upset, her head starts to glow. It's kind of like a metaphor for being in your own head, or being like upset or self-conscious. And then there's this whole kind of fun subplot of Kim trying to like take a picture of Ramona just to prove that her head glows when she gets upset. So I think that was really, really fun. But anyway, as the story goes on, Kim actually gets kidnapped by the Katinagi twins, and the twins challenge Scott to a fight in order to save her. So then Scott goes to rescue Kim, but it's all a trap, and the Katinagis battle Scott. He's beaten down, he doesn't really know what to do, he's losing hope, and the Katinagi twins are saying Ramona's not worth it, you should just join us here in the League and then we can like help you. But then Kim actually helps him out. She pretends to take out her phone and then see that she got a text message from Ramona encouraging him to keep fighting and that she loves him, but really like nothing's on the screen. It's really just the goodness within Kim's heart and the fact that she sees how much Ramona means to Scott that she would do this. I think that's a really cool element. Kind of makes me bummed out that we didn't really get to see that in the movie, but oh well, hopefully we'll see it in the anime. Then Scott feels inspired again, he defeats the Katinagis and then frees Kim, and then Kim encourages him to go find Ramona, so then he goes to her. So he comes back to the apartment, but then he sees that Ramona like cut her hair, because that's another subplot that happens in the story, is that Ramona dyes her hair every 3 weeks, and that Ramona being a character who changes a lot, and then Scott wanting to be someone who kind of stays the same. So then I guess there's this whole kind of like subplot with like haircuts where Scott cut his hair during his big breakup with Envy, and he thinks that that's the reason why they broke up and everything like that. So he's been cutting his own hair ever since. So kind of like as the earlier novels go on, his hair gets longer and longer and longer. He gets jealous of people who's gotten haircuts, like Steven Stills, like, you got a haircut? But I was supposed to get a haircut and all this stuff. So I thought that was really funny. So then finally at the end of volume 3, Ramona finally gives him a haircut. He's finally accepting a change, now that Envy's out of his life and that he can finally move on with Ramona. But anyway, back to volume 5. Ramona cut her hair and Scott's wondering like what's going on. Her head starts to glow. She says it's been great and then disappears, and Scott's kind of left like, wait, what do I do? Kind of left with her cat named Gideon, who's another side character in there as well. So then Gideon the cat escapes. He tries to go after her, but the cat, locks himself out and he's kind of just bumming around from place to place, trying to find a place to sleep and everything like that. And then finally at the end of it, he gets a phone call, he answers it, and then realizes that it's Gideon who's challenging him to a fight. So then the 5th volume kind of ends there, and it's a cliffhanger of like, what's going to happen in the big finale? So we finally get to volume 6, the last book in the series, and yeah, I think this one's probably like my 3rd favorite. Obviously I like how it's like the ending to the whole series, but there's some elements with the ending that I'm kind of like on, but yeah, I'll get to that in a second. So yeah, then we open with Scott at his lowest point. He doesn't really know what to do. He's miserable. He's just kind of sitting around playing video games. Kim's moved away. Steven's recording the album with Joseph. Young Neil's kind of just like off the rails right now. Knives is still trying to be in Scott's life and be encouraging, but obviously she's about to go off to college. So the first part of the novel is kind of Scott trying to reconcile all these different relationships that he's been in the past. He tries to reconcile with Knives and tries to kiss her, and then obviously it feels horrible because she's obviously this young girl and everything like that. He tries to reconcile with Envy and try to like realize like why everything ended so badly, and kind of like what I was saying earlier, it's implied that he had a drinking problem and probably like an anger issue, and Envy didn't want to have anything to do with that, so it was kind of like more of like a mutual breaking up at that point. And then it kind of gets revealed later like why his memory was all messed up, but I'll get to that in a second. He tries to reconcile with Kim because Wallace recommends Scott go for a wilderness sabbatical in order to clear his head and kind of train himself up for this final fight with Gideon. Gideon, and reconciles with Kim, has a confrontation with his negative side, and then Kim says that he can't keep running away from Scott because, like I said earlier, he's kind of like a representation of all these like different past memories that he had. And then he finally accepts the fact that he hurt all these people, and then he merges with Scott, and then all these memories kind of come flooding back into his head about like how he hurt Knives, how he hurt Envy, how he hurt Kim, and how he hurt Ramona, and that kind of motivates him to finally kind of go and find Gideon, go to the Chaos Theater, and fight for Ramona. So we finally cut to Chaos Theater. Scott's finally motivated to go against Gideon. Gideon confronts him and realizes that Ramona's not there, and he's wondering like, what the heck's going on? I set all this up for the fact that you would still be with Ramona, but whatever, I guess I'll still try to defeat you. So they fight, have their whole confrontation, but then Gideon's too powerful, takes a sword from Scott and kills him with it. So then Scott's dead. He goes into subspace, then meets up with Ramona, who kind of motivates him, and they kind of have their whole reconciliation about how they're both like really bad people. They don't necessarily want to like fight for each other, they just want to fight for themselves, be better people. And then Scott gets revealed to have an extra life because when he killed Todd Ingram in Volume 3, he actually received an extra life. So he uses that, comes back to life with Ramona. They work together to fight Gideon. Gideon almost defeats them, uses his sword to try to slay Ramona, but then Scott and Ramona decide to go into her subspace purse and fight Gideon that way. Because there's another thing that gets revealed is that Ramona is actually able to use subspace, and then subspace actually goes through her head as well, and that's kind of like a side effect of the glow that she has from her head. So they go into subspace, they confront Gideon, and then a version of Ramona who's kind of like subservient to him. He grows into this kind of giant monster dragon thing, but Scott and Ramona team up, defeat him. Scott headbutts him, everything kind of explodes out of the subspace. They return to the real world, and they team up to finally defeat Gideon. Gideon's obviously acting all crazy. It's revealed that he's had his other 7 girlfriends in cryo sleep, and that he plans to marry all of them at the same time, which is kind of a weird subplot, but oh well. So they work together, defeat him. They get $7,777,707 worth of Canadian coins. It kind of rains down the audience, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, coins, God, that hurts. Then we have Happily Ever After. Scott finally has his closure with Envy, and they hug, because that's another thing at the end of Volume 3, is that Scott tries to reconcile things with Envy after defeating Todd, but she kind of just walks away, and Scott's very upset that he didn't get any closure with that. So finally they have their hug, they have closure. Kind of cut to a couple days later. Kim and Scott decide to have their own band and just kind of play for fun. Steven's revealed to be in a relationship with Joseph, and they have their whole happy relationship, and Scott's all mind blown about that. Scott sees Knives off to college and like wishes her good luck, and Knives will always have like a special place in her heart for him. Then we finally cut to the ending with Scott and Ramona deciding to try again. And they hold hands, they go to one of the doors to subspace, which is another thing that gets introduced in Volume 1, is that kind of start their whole relationship was kind of going through this door into the unknown. So then they're going through that again at the end of Volume 6, and they kind of jump through the door into subspace and then kind of fade into white, and then that's the end of Scott Pilgrim. So yeah, overall, I really like this story. I really like the fact that Scott just kind of starts off this very broken character, doesn't really know what to do or how to approach a relationship. And then kind of as these events go on, he kind of matures not only to respect others, but also respect himself and kind of be in a real adult relationship, where there's baggage with him, baggage with her. That's what relationships are about. People have baggage who come together, try to work things out and, try to mature and kind of try to understand each other. So yeah, I really like the message that Brian Lee O'Malley's trying to do with this story. Not something that they did with the movie. With the movie, it was kind of more of like this kind of nerdy kid trying to gain confidence and then mature into this adult relationship. But with this one, he's a very like arrogant character at first. Like he thinks he's more awesome than he really is. He kind of tries to like deflect where people are trying to criticize him. And then as the story goes on, he kind of realizes like, hey, I'm not as awesome as I think I am. I'm actually a pretty crappy person, and I really need to fix myself and work on myself. So yeah, I'm glad that we didn't get kind of like a traditional character with this graphic novel series. So yeah, I applaud Brian Lee O'Malley for that. But yeah, those are all my thoughts on the Scott Pilgrim graphic novel series. I hope you enjoyed this, and what's your favorite moment from the graphic novel series? Who's your favorite X? What's your favorite fight? What's your favorite line from it? Whatever it is, be sure to leave it in the comments below. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more videos, and see you next time. 1, 2,